Aenig by Cáel. Chapter 7. Thrisha was both pleased and not about the last-minute additions to her party. The foragers became antsy and anxious with Cáel around, and she would be one of the few to admit that it made things both better and more difficult. Her people worked faster, and that was always welcome, but they also became more aware of him than they did of their surroundings, and that made things dangerous. "I'm only allowing this because you asked," she said to Damien, tilting back her khaki hat to look up at the man. "Ukwa's going out for the first time since he got here, and I don't really need more people on edge, you know." "You're a gem," the soldier smiled warmly, his entire form letting go of a tense breath. "Though I know you're secretly happy that Cáel's coming along." "I know that nothing will get to me," she replied with an easy shrug. "You sure you don't want to come with? We're going into uncharted land. Who knows? You could bump your elbow and have an excuse to go see the sexy nurse." Damien blushed bright red and coughed to hide it. "Subtle," Thrisha deadpanned, one hand finding her hip while the other poked the man in the chest. "Why haven't you asked her out yet? You've only been pining after her uselessly since she got here." Damien shoved the woman lightly. Her utility belt clinked as she stumbled a few steps. "I have not been pining," he stated, although who he thought he was fooling, Thrisha had no idea. "And besides," he continued, attempting to save face, "she's a doctor, not a nurse." "Great," Thrisha beamed, righting herself from her stumble indignantly. "The next time she sticks you with a needle, you can ask to stick her back." Damien blushed 50 different shades of scandalized as the foreigner straightened her hat back out. Trust Damien Heckart to be in the middle of a bloody apocalypse and still splutter at explicit innuendos. "All right, big man, I'll see you when I get back. And if you haven't at least asked that girl out, I'm going to lock the two of you in the generator room." She dismissed him before he could even form a protest by calling to her team. "All right, people, let's go!" Thrisha walked calmly as they entered a small plot of land. It looked like it used to be a farmhouse, now overrun by grapevines, which grew thick and green with lush berries. She placed her hands on her hips and watched the scouts spread out. She breathed deeply, fresh air that hadn't been filtered. It was glorious. "All right, everyone," she called to the group once the scouts had given her the all clear. "Collect your shots and then I'll hand out assignments." She held out her palm. Cradled inside lay a sizable stack of little pills. The regulars instantly pocketed them, but Ukwa looked skeptically at the tiny things. "What is this?" he asked flatly. "Quite simply, it's an adrenaline boost," the woman explained. "Just in case shit goes sideways. I wouldn't suggest that you take it unless you're really in trouble. It packs quite a punch." "You can say that again," Yana chuckled, stepping forward to take a pill for herself. "They're kind of like epinephrine, except we get ours directly from the pigs in farming." "I see." The big man still looked less than impressed. "I don't use your weapons," he insisted, taking a step back and away from Thrisha's hand. "Why do I need this?" "It's so you can run, numbskull," Cáel piped up. "In case you've forgotten, the Memphs are stronger and faster than us." He walked right up to the man, plucking a pill from their mission leader's palm, and didn't look any less for having to practically crane his neck to meet the man's eyes. He closed Ukwa's fist himself. "This just evens the odds." "Right," Thrisha broke the tension she could feel stirring. "Here are your assignments. Jeannie, Mandla, you two can start collecting grapes. We'll be having dessert tonight." The two groaned. They would have to track back and forth to the city, and they weren't allowed to burden their scouts. Quit complaining, Thrisha snapped curtly. You want to find cells instead? The two quickly shook their heads and pulled satchels from their backs to begin picking. Thrisha caught Maisha's eye and gestured towards the two young foragers with her head. The man offered the older woman a low, dramatic bow and walked over to his chargers. Once he loosened them up, they would be laughing soon enough, the job going quicker without them looking over their shoulders constantly. Andre, Simon, and Ukwa, she called, getting the rest of her group's attention. You're with Yana and Silas. From the lack of power cables, I'm guessing this farm had a generator. Find it and take it back to the city. We need the whole thing because engineering has asked for spare parts. The foragers nodded, before following their assigned scouts off towards the back of the house, and the small shed that had been discovered there. It amused Thrisha how people behaved differently the longer they'd been here. She'd been an entomologist before the outbreak. Bees were her speciality, and she loved applying her behavioral algorithms to the people she now lived with. The ones who'd been doing this longer trusted the scouts, moved with them without speaking, like the entire thing had been rehearsed. The newer recruits were still in survival mode. Not that the feeling ever truly went away, self-preservation and all that. Humans never really could fully practice the whole individuals working for the greater good thing, though the city had certainly given it a fair shot. She finally turned to Cáel, now distracted by some pretty weeds in the long grass. She gently nudged him with her foot once the others were out of earshot. He glanced up at her, squinting into the sunlit sky at her back. She nodded in the direction of the house, and he pulled himself up with a grunt. She'd found out, soon after her first mission with the man, that if she didn't speak to him, he wouldn't comment back. His tongue was lightning quick, and his mind a storage of childishly witty comebacks. Maybe she'd entertain him later. She let him take the lead, and followed a few steps behind as Cáel carefully stepped up onto the wooden deck that surrounded the farmhouse. The outbreak had been kinder to the property than some others they'd come across. Small weeds with orange flowers slithered through the gap in the deck, and the grapevine, which had taken over the house, arched around the doorframe instead of covering it completely. The scout tried the knob, but had to put a shoulder behind the push for it to open. Besides a soft whine, echoed by the beyond rusted hinges, it swung open without a hitch. Even in his heavy boots, the man moved, feather-light, through the kitchen, and into what Thrisha could barely make out as a lounge. He slipped around the corner, and Thrisha stepped calmly into the house. It was a classic farmhouse, light floral curtains and a huge pine island in the middle of the kitchen, copper fittings on all the plumbing and chipped paint on the cupboards, haphazardly but sturdily built into the walls. She opened one inquisitively and grinned when she found that it did indeed have a back. Those could be useful. She just made a mental note that she'd need to gather her team to transport the structures back to the city when Cáel reappeared back in the doorway. Nobody's home, he sighed, only appearing mildly disappointed about the lack of potential mutilation from the result of what was most likely a biochemical leak. That was Thrisha's theory on what caused the outbreak. I reappropriated some smaller cells from the fixtures. He shook a small bag that clinked like glass. They have a pretty well-stocked artillery, mostly rifles, and I'm sure that they could work again once the blacksmiths get the dust out the gears. Anything in the line of the list? She asked offhandedly, still trying to figure out how they could dismount the cabinets. They had a dog. Thrisha only just stopped herself from responding to his taunting her to ask about it. Instead, she settled on, "Could you go tell the others that they'll need to come back with a truck? I'll start packing up." Cáel accepted her request surprisingly quickly, offering her a salute, and lazily made for the door. He was more than likely already bored and wanted to leave. Thrisha took a deep breath and started unpacking non-perishables from the cupboard. A thump stopped her. She listened hard, but didn't hear anything else, and was about to go back to her work. Then she heard it again. "They've already left," Cáel announced upon his re-entry, "but I let Gavin and Combs know, so they'll bring the truck—" "Hush!" she hissed. They waited in silence. The wind shifted the grass outside. The wood in the house groaned louder than it did before. "What is it?" Cáel murmured. She hadn't even heard him move beside her. His bracer hummed softly as it started up. It sounded too loud in the quiet. "I thought I heard." "Cáel, get behind me," the scout whispered the order curtly, already shifting the woman to his back as metal scraped on metal and the soft scent of copper filled the air. "If you get the chance, you run," he commanded in a hushed tone. "I don't care if it's just that dog. You leave your bags and you get out of here." "But the resources." "You can't come back for them if you're dead," he chided her, though his attention had shifted to the floor and the source of the thumps. "I'm not going back empty-handed," she hissed, unimpressed that he was still managing to crowd her towards the door without even looking. "Whatever, just don't get in my way," he grumbled. "Does it sound like it's getting closer?" The floor between the kitchen and the porch splintered, and a memph crawled out. Cáel shot forward, and the creature was dead before it got halfway. Thrisha grabbed her bag and held it tight as she searched for another way out. She could hear more down below, scurrying and clambering to get to the surface. They must have been sleeping in the basement, and their entry had woken the pack. "Run!" Cáel shouted, before disappearing into the hole. She did. She sprinted past the lounge and slammed through the front door. Thanks small blessings, the wood had deteriorated enough that it crumbled away from the lock. She'd barely got more than 10 meters past the fence when she stopped. Thrisha cursed hard as her body froze, fight and flight, fighting with her moral compass. Wasn't she just complaining about people abandoning their own? She was probably safer in the house anyway, as long as Cáel was still alive and the memphs hadn't broken through to the surface. "Oh, God damn it," she cursed herself, and she turned and sprinted back into the house, just in time to see Cáel flying out of the hole. He landed hard on the kitchen table. Due to termite damage compromising its structural integrity and the force of a grown man, the once strong wooden structure crumpled into powder and splinters. "Cáel!" she shouted, running over to pull the scouts out of the debris, only to cringe at the sheer amount of blood. "Come on, get up. We need to leave." "What are you still doing here?" He coughed, trying desperately to pull air back into his lungs. "You've had my Cebus cells." She tried for deadpan, though it came out panicked. She forced her disgust aside to pull the man to his feet. "Well, it's a good thing you wore the brown shorts," he wheezed out on a chuckle. She rolled her eyes and slung her free arm around his shoulders. "What? You're about to shit yourself," he grinned. She bulked indignantly. "I would never!" The thump of a paw on the splintered floor stopped her dead. The sound of scraping grit made her turn, and Thrisha would have laughed if she could see how pale she'd gone. Instead, she considered commending Cáel on his psychic abilities, as the biggest memph she'd ever seen crawled out of the pit. It was at least twice as big as any other, and far more muscular. Its clawed hands were easily the size of her head, and the scars that littered its body reminded her of the scout leaning heavily against her. Shit, he was injured. "Cáel, maybe you should take a shot," Thrisha murmured, her voice soft and shrill with fear. I don't have any," he whispered back. "What?" she hissed, slowly pushing the man back towards the front door she'd previously escaped from. "I gave it to the big guy," he admitted. At least the idiot had the decency to sound sorry about it for half a bloody second. "He's huge," Cáel hissed, instantly going right back into excuses. One wouldn't have done anything for him. The thing's head shot in their direction, when their shifting feet caused a spark of static from the old carpet, and it let out a bellowing roar. They instantly let go of each other, having to cover their ears at the sheer volume of the sound so close. Cáel found his voice first, and he shoved Thrisha towards the door. "Run!" he screamed. She did, and the creature lunged after them. They cleared the doorway, and Thrisha fumbled for her shot, but it slipped from her fingers when the beast, that should have got caught in the threshold only ripped through it like it was paper. And then Cáel was gone. The scout was ripped away from her side and thrown back into the porch in an explosion of splinters and vines. She turned out of instinct, and the Memph towered above her. She barely had time to duck and roll before it pounced. It skidded in the dirt, and she was completely at a loss as to where to run. It launched itself at her again. Its teeth barely missed her leg as she dove aside. She could see Cáel climbing out of the debris that used to be the porch, but he looked dazed. She was on her own. Damn! Damn her for going back in the first place. It was stalking her now. As she got to her feet, checking for her next move and calculating as much as she was, its dead eyes analyzed her every twitch and its nostrils flared, scenting her fear. Its feet dug into the earth, and she was sure she was about to die when a war cry sounded, and the next thing she knew, her scout was riding the thing like a damn rodeo bull. "Cáel!" she shouted, half concern and half relief bleeding into her voice. He slashed at its back, and it held as it shook him free. He landed hard beside Thrisha and grinned at her, a familiar little pill between his teeth. The man swallowed, and he was on his feet again a moment later, running at it again. He took off the claw that swiped at his head, and he skid beneath it. The beast bellowed in anger, a sound Thrisha had never heard any Memph make, even in her years before the city had found her. It wasn't stopping. It wasn't reacting to the blood like the others. They were so screwed. Why isn't it going down? She panicked, backing hurriedly away, while Cáel climbed the thing like a jungle gym and straddled its shoulders. "It's about to," the scout shouted back. He shoved his sword into the back of its neck, with a twist and a cry too similar to the creature's for comfort. Its head dropped. The body seemed to be in shock. It twitched for a moment before following the severed cranium to the ground. Thrisha held in a scream as the scout dismounted his kill, smiling like a child on Christmas and covered from head to toe in blood, more of it his own than she liked. The drops followed predetermined canals, the path laid out by the scars marring his flesh, a gruesome imitation of one of the most terrifying forms of war paint she had the disservice of bearing witness to. "That was fun," he choked, his grin ever so slightly marring his ability to speak, and an unnerving twitch to his movements. Thrisha stepped back jerkily. What the hell was that thing? Her voice was so soft and shaky, it was a wonder he heard enough to reply. What with the rush of blood as a melody to the pounding of his heart in his ears. "I don't know," he grit out. The pill had left a funny aftertaste on his tongue. "But I wonder if there are any more." "We should get out of here," she stuttered, trying to hold it together. He scoffed and muttered something that sounded a lot like killjoy, as the sound of a truck coming closer finally brought back the sounds of the outside. The rush of blood pounding in her ears softened to a dull thrum, to make space for the wind in the grass, and the creak-crack of the farmhouse as it tried to stay standing, what with its front wall now splintered into non-existence. Thrisha didn't see any of her foragers. Only the scouts they'd been with jumped from the transport, gauntlets at the ready. "You missed all the fun!" Cáel chuckled heartily, opening his arms wide to introduce them to the show, as they stared at the dismembered creature in shock and disbelief. "Thrisha?" He put a hand on her shoulder and she twitched, slowly turning to stare up at him. She was shaking and terrified. "Thrisha," he said, softer that time, but the smile on his face was still so unnerving. "It's all right. It's dead. You need to tell us what to do now." She shook herself and pulled it together as much as she could. She quickly barked instructions to evacuate the area as soon as humanly possible. "Let's take it back to the city," she decided, glancing over the still leaking corpse. "Let Aisha take a look at it." "Oh, because she'll know what to do with it," Cáel chuckled sarcastically, but he did pick up the head in both arms and began carrying it to the truck. He turned back to look at her about halfway there. "What about your cupboards?"